wanted to hop on with you online, of course, because we're getting all these questions about what DeepSeek means for AI in general, and what does it mean for Prospector, of course, from folks too. But I wanted to hop on and allow folks to ask some questions as we kind of go through this. So could we start with just having you break down what are some of the key takeaways from the DeepSeek news this mean? Like what happened and what makes it significant within the AI space?
Yeah, and so the first thing I'll say is this is not, there's news this week, but this has been a building thing that's been going on for a while, right? So for instance, last year, DeepSeek released something called V2 sometime around May. And this caused a huge disruption in the Chinese market because they were serving up a model that's comparable to what you might use in ChatGPT now, or Baidu, which is the Chinese equivalent, for 14 cents per a million tokens, right? And to put that into context, if you are using something similar with ChatGPT or Anthropic or Claude, typically on the higher end models, you're paying $15-20 for a million tokens. So that's a big price drop, right? And so it wasn't quite at what we would say GPT-4, people have been using it. And then comes this fall where what happens is they come out with V3 and now they've come out with something called R1. So V3 is kind of a normal chat, like what we would think of our normal, like when ChatGPT came out, right? It's answering, responding, doing those things. R1 is significant because it is what's called a reasoning model. So when GPT 3.5 came out and GPT-4, people started using prompt techniques to do all kinds of new things, and they found ways to get the models to perform better, to do certain tasks. One of those things was telling the model, when you're asking the question, is take a minute to think about it and think about the steps you want to take, and then respond. And what folks quickly realized through this research is that you were getting significantly better results from the models. And so OpenAI is using this for, if anyone's followed the news about their O1 and then their O3 models, these are the reasoning models, which are seeing like a lot better results. They're performing much better on a lot of benchmarks. There are some they perform less on. We won't get into the semantics of all those benchmarks. And so DeepSeek was able to do this using new techniques, right? But the thing about DeepSeek is in China. So they haven't had access to the higher end GPUs from NVIDIA because of some of the US policies. And they were able to actually put their V3 model, right, which is like a GPT-4 equivalent, for 100th or so of the cost, right, of what it's costing other models. So I think this has a lot of folks nervous. To be truthful, there's some lack of transparency in their full cost, and so there's some debate about how much did it actually cost them to do that, and how do you benchmark against other companies. But the big takeaway is, hey, there's this company startup that's been able to do something a lot cheaper than what we thought it was going to take to create high quality models. And because of that, companies like NVIDIA, whose stock has really gone through the roof, thinking with the need that there's going to be a continued demand for these chips, is that there may be another alternative that doesn't require this. And the open source, and I would say the second part of this is that the open source community likely is closing the gap at their ability to keep up with the closed source community. And when we say closed source, we mean companies that don't share their models openly for others to use the weights. So it's interesting. I think there will be more to come, but for us, I think it means that we get access to cheaper, better things for cheaper in the long run.
Well, and to diverge a little bit, I know part of what we've learned at Prospector that I hear folks talk about with DeepSeek is like, constraints on resources actually typically breed creativity in this space, right? And then it may have actually helped DeepSeek kind of surge ahead is because they didn't have all of the money to kind of put towards these expensive chips. They had to figure out other ways to solve the problem.
Yeah, and what's even interesting, and there's still, the capability isn't fully there, but there's a group, so DeepSeek spent about $6 million or so. Yeah, normally it's like hundreds of millions for a model of these quality. There is a group in UC Berkeley that tested some of the things proposed in their paper. And they were, it's a smaller size model, but pretty high capabilities. It's the other thing about DeepSeek is that they're providing something at a much higher capability at a smaller model. So what that means is you need less not only do you need less compute to train the model, but you need less compute to ask the model questions, what we call inference. And this group in UCal Berkeley, they did this with a very small model, and they did it for $30.
Yeah. Wow.
Right. So I mean, there's a lot of like work that needs to be done to validate some of these findings and things, but it's telling, right? And I think this is why there's a lot of panic. If you're doing general purpose models, right? If you're OpenAI, if you're Anthropic, if you're, these other Google, right? Other big players, you're nervous because it's becoming a lot easier to catch you a lot faster. The moat's not there that you previously thought that there was. And if you're NVIDIA, you're thinking, oh, maybe my chips aren't as important as I previously thought they were going to be. And so it's, for us, right, this is something where we are not a huge company, right? And we made a conscious decision that we were not going to train models. Not so much for these specific reasons, but because, the cost of compute is high, and our resources are best spent on not the training, but in the asking the right questions and fine tuning of things.
Right.
You focus on data extraction that is really specific to us, right? Like even if you do a general purpose model, there's always going to be things and tasks that it's going to be not as fine tuned towards, because, companies don't care about intercept results, or they don't care about NPVs for technical reports, right? That's not the top priority for OpenAI or Anthropic and stuff. So it is for us, right? And this is where we focus on employing different models to do those tasks.
Well, and that's where one of the great analogies that I heard, and you and I both love the Wall Street Journal's Journal podcast, right? And the analogy that they used was that these other big companies are basically, if you think of like AI as a librarian that lives in the library, like these other big companies are a librarian that went through and read all of the books in the library in order to answer your question. Whereas what DeepSeek is doing is it's a librarian that just has figured out how to find the right book that it needs to read in order to answer your question. And it hasn't gone through and actually had to read everything.
Yeah.
I thought such a cool analogy even for what we do, because so much of what we do in refining the models and working with them on these mining specific topics, it's like we're going to summarize the information and then help you get to that data, help you get to that information faster, right?
Yeah, and I think that part of this is why we spend so much time on what we call information retrieval, right? If you're asking a question, how do we find the right context that goes with that question, so that it can be answered appropriately and cited, right?
Yeah.
And when you do big models, what you're doing is you're consuming lots and lots of text and your data that goes together, that's sitting in these weights. And if you're not providing documents as context and things, it's trying to respond with what it has in its weight. So the bigger the model, typically the more knowledge it has. But there's limitations to that. And anyone who's used something like a model that can access the internet versus not, you'll notice the difference in the quality of information you get. But even for us, right, we don't just use the internet. We try to sit these models on top of all the public filings that we have, and then categorize them. We summarize certain things. We extract pieces of text that make it easier for the model to find, or that we're leveraging in that moment, to find the text that it needs to answer the question, right? Because it becomes a lot more of an issue of how do you organize information, rather than as these models kind of reach a moment of having very similar capabilities, and they become commoditized, and you can kind of pick, right? Now it's about how do you deliver the information to go with a given model to answer the question that best suits the user's needs and problems.
And to dive in a little more specifically, like how do you think all of these advancements that are coming out with like DeepSeek and hopefully more competitors, right? More groups that kind of are able to do this kind of stuff. Like how can that be applied to the mining industry at large, like even past what we do at Prospector?
I mean, I think this means you're going to see, so this is what we're seeing with reasoning models, right? I think we're already seeing this with multimodal models. So the models that can read both text and images. So, the thing that I think about is the big holdback for the general purpose models is they're running out of data, right? We know this. And so that's why these reasoning techniques have been used to kind of get them maybe a bit further, right? But there are a lot of theories out there that we may be hitting a limit, right? Like maybe AGI is a little further off than we think because we don't have the data, right? Maybe, but likely the solution to that is, how do we get more data? Well, we likely need to go to legacy documents. things that need to be scanned. To do that effectively, if anyone's ever used a bad OCR model, that that causes a lot of errors, right? So if you're taking, for instance, if you're taking a drill log, right, and your numbers are not being recorded by the OCR engine correctly, that's a problem, right? But if you can say take higher, better multimodal models that can be used as OCR engines, which is one of the great things about multimodal models, that they're starting to replace what we would legacy use as just you take a page, an image, and you do OCR and it goes through. But now these models are multimodal. They have a lot higher capability and they can understand a lot more context on the page. And so when we're taking a scanned document and we can ask the model to that interpretation, and that becomes open source and it becomes higher quality, I think there's a lot of really big implications. So we know that there are so many governments, mining companies out there that have documents that need to be scanned. They're not going to be these nice PDFs where the text comes off neatly, right? And that's just the opportunity to get so much more data. And I think that'll be really one of the exciting things as as we look at how the open source community evolves, right? And if these techniques can then apply to what we're doing with reasoning models and these higher end models to multimodal models, because I think that's probably the thing outside of our normal business that probably is going to have the biggest impact on some of the exploration side of the mining industry.
Well, and that's where I would just encourage, because we have been playing around with some of this stuff at Prospector, right? So for anybody who's listening or joining live, like, please reach out to us if you'd like to dive deeper into that, and stop by and see us at PDAC. If any of you are going there, right, and come to our party on Tuesday night. But I do think it's fascinating, because the more we dig in to not just like the disclosure documents that are kind of the fundamental data kind of basement kind of foundation of Prospector, but getting more into the documents that companies have, legacy documents, as well as like geological surveys with some of the stuff we've been doing in Guyana and other kind of cool pilot projects we've been working on. It gets way more complex, and this compute power and all these things have been big constraints, right? So I'm really excited to kind of see where it goes for us and a lot of our kind of peers in the startup space. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, so when we look at the big AI challenges related to mining, you mentioned things like legacy documents and drill data. Like, are there any other big AI challenges in the industry that you think, advancements like what DeepSeek has done can help solve?
I mean, I think, one of the other advancements that I'm excited about, and I think this is where we're working on a product now to work well with this, is the improvement of speech to text and text to speech technology. Why is that important for the mining industry, right? So when we think about content, right, like how much can an individual human read, right, versus how much can you consume when you're listening to something? And something that we are actively working on, right, is so we go through lots of documents. We create summaries, we extract data, we look for events, we use all this stuff to curate the data sets that we have, right? Mm-hmm. The way that we are thinking about this going forward is, okay, how do we use that data to then generate some sort of narrative or audio on a particular topic? Let's say you care about exploration activity that's going on across sub-Saharan Africa or just West Africa, and you want to follow every mine that's in that region, and you want to track major events, major intercepts, all this stuff, and you want to track it once a week. What if I could produce a 10-minute audio file that sounded like a human being was giving you a customized highlights of that, and then telling you the documents you could go talk about, and then go research it, so that is how you monitor things, and then you go do your research, right? So instead of you going through and searching and trying to follow a company, go here, you're getting something that's proactively given to you that allows you to consume much more information than you could ever consume by just reading a document, right? Like if you're trying to go through every single tech report, everything, this becomes a lot, right? And it doesn't replace things, but it's an augmenting to how you think about your content and how you want to consume it. And I think this is one of the other areas where we're excited about, where we think there's a lot of potential, right, when we think about trying to keep track of everything that's going on in the industry.
Absolutely. And I just put a message in there. If anybody wants to try that out, it's not 100% hypothetical. We really are, again, sneak peek kind of working on that. Would love to hear what folks think. either on the live stream, of course, but also offline, like if that's interesting to you. And what I love about that, of course, as a podcast host, right? Plug for On the Rocks. But what I think is really cool too is the ability to get that information out to a whole team, right? Rather than, again, everybody having to kind of read through documents, and like how many of us just get bombarded with emails and reports and stuff, and like actually sit down and read it. So I think that's a really fascinating kind of new thing that we might be able to do that, again, gets easier with advancements like this. Well, with all of this stuff like evolving so fast, John, like, and you and I talk a lot about the fact that that's why we don't consider like models or, custom models or anything to be our moat at Prospector, right? Because they change so fast and everything is and it's expensive. But like, how should startups and companies that want to play in this space stay ahead in how they leverage AI? And I guess similarly, mining and exploration companies, right? If they want to pull AI into their flow, their work environment, like how do you stay ahead?
I mean, again, I would get all back to the data, right? This is all about understanding, curating, and processing data and figuring out ways where you understand the questions that need to be asked and how they can be answered with the information that is available. And then employing the most cost-efficient, correct, and accurate models you can in processes that are going to deliver that information, right? And there's going to be, we're going to see price drops and stuff, right? And, do we need an AGI talking to us to give all that information, or do we need something that is very targeted, low cost, that can give us the data points that we need to make a decision, right? And I think this is where we focus, and I think it's important, and it's why we focus in our vertical, is that a general purpose AI, yes, it could have a lot of benefits for humanity and things, but there are still a ton of benefits without even getting to AGI. There are so many things that we can do with AI already that have the opportunity to really unlock a lot of things and augment the way we do stuff. And it's every time we think about, curating things like production statistics and resources and reserves, how do we do that? Every single day, we have processes that leverage different models that that monitor filings, predict, do a prediction of extraction, have our analysts review it, and then input into a database. So it's curated, right? That saves at sometimes 80 to 90% of our analyst time, right, when they're collecting things. I would always think about that. I would never expect the AI to replace something, right? It's always about how can the AI save time and how can it reduce the amount of effort into do something. We may get to a world where the AI can replace certain things, and I think that we already see some of that stuff. It happens with automated trading, those kind of things. It happens with the algorithms running our social media feeds, right? But is that going to be what works for some of these problem sets? Yes, at some point, likely. But we're in a point now where there's just so much you can already do with what we already have, and it's going to get a lot cheaper here in the coming months to do that.
Well, that's where, just to reinforce, like sometimes I joke that at Prospector we focus on the boring stuff so you don't have to. Right? Like, I mean, having your data be like really consistent and clean and structured in the way so that as new stuff comes out, right, this is what's so important about it, like, so that you can incorporate new tools, new models, new, advancements. Like, if you've got a really clean, consistent, updated, current data set, you can incorporate all that stuff into what you're doing, right? If you're focused more on that, like, cool, sexy model development stuff, like, but your data is crappy, like every time you try to do something new, you're going to be dealing with issues with your fundamentals.
Yeah, and as an example, right, and we also have to remember, so when you go use a model, right, one of the main things that happens at the upfront of the model is there's what's called tokenization of words, right? So basically, it's taking your words and it's preparing it to turn it into a series of numbers that can then be passed to the model. When that happens, it's important how that gets transformed. And so, for instance, companies like Bloomberg, right, they can't use the same tokenizer that a company like ChatGPT, that OpenAI uses, or Anthropic, right? Because the tokenizers that are used for those companies are optimized on sentence structures, right? And what happens inside of a number that's inside of text? What's something that's inside of a number that's might confuse something that's a sentence, Emily?
Oh, what's inside what?
Yeah. That you
Like,
have, if you have a million, what do you have two of in a million?
commas.
Yes. Right. So it's important, right, that when you're tokenizing a number, right, that number doesn't get split, because if that number gets split when it goes through a model and the model doesn't have enough context on it, right, that can cause inaccuracies in reporting, right? Now this doesn't happen a lot because the models are they're able to fill in the gaps, right? But it is something where I know the more financially focused groups, like say Bloomberg, they fine-tune models that are specifically tokenizing to make sure those numbers don't get chopped, right? Because it can really affect the way that the model responds and answers and is using things in context. And so there's little things like that we got to keep in mind, and why, someone who's developing a general purpose model like OpenAI or Anthropic or Google, right? They're not always going to be doing the thing that's optimized for your use case, right? But you can look at the way their model works and leverage it, or look at the open source community for things like Llama or DeepSeek, right? To leverage and suit them to your use case, right? To make sure that these things are not a problem for what you're trying to solve.
Well, and that's why also, like, we talk about, especially with some of our partners and clients that are focused on their internal data, like why it can be more challenging to use these tools on things like assay results and drill core announcement, like, because even like units of measure, right? Or in trying to make sure, is it metric ton or the other ton, right? Like, I mean, there are all these things where the context is so important when you're trying to use this stuff in a mining and exploration context, like assay results, especially, man, if everyone could just agree on like how, right? Like how we're going to report stuff, it would make it much easier on all of our little AI tools.
Yeah. Well,
so that's never going to
happen.
Australians
have, the Canadians have not.
The what?
The Australians have, but the Canadians have not.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you, John. Any last thoughts? I know we kicked it off a little bit late.
No, I mean, the one thing I'll say, right, is I think there's a lot of hype around this. There's a lot of speculation as to the actual cost of doing this and whether or not DeepSeek had the chips. You'll see some of that come out. Yeah. I think the important is that there's some questioning about whether we need to invest as much into high computing GPU resources to accomplish this. And I think that we're going to see this going forward. I would watch what's out there. But I think that we'll continue to focus on leveraging models that others are creating and fine-tuning where necessary. But this is, again, it's why we focus on curating data and using AI to do so, not so much on creating the model that's going to do that, and for some of these reasons.
Well, and understanding, as you said at the beginning, like understanding the questions, right?
Yeah.
What are the questions people actually need the data to answer, and how do you build tools that help you get those answers, right? I mean, so much of that is, you can build really cool stuff, but it's going to sit on a shelf if it doesn't help somebody achieve something that's important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. All right. Thanks, John. Thanks everybody for joining, and hope any of you who are not able to join us live watch it afterwards.
Thank you.